we perhaps sort of could have a panel discussion about the Edwardian castles. If you could join us, Alastair. Right, thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy is one of the people who was joining us for Andy's talk. Jeremy is head of property at English Heritage. Is that your correct title, Jeremy?
Very nearly. Thanks very much, Philip. This is possibly the most immodest thing that I've ever done in answering a call for someone who knows anything about Edwardian castles in Wales. And I'm sure that other people on this call will demonstrate that they know more than I do. But my title is I'm Head Properties Curator at English Heritage. There's a clue in the title. My responsibilities stop on the English side of the border. But Cadw, Welsh Historical Monuments, my good friends, periodically allow me to go and play with their favourite sites. And to that end, I have had great fun over the years writing the official guidebooks to Conwy, Beaumaris and Harlech Castle, and I'm about to begin work with some trepidation on Carnarvon. So,
and so Andy's talk was going to then illustrate the ways in which Edward I stamped his authority across North Wales, and particularly, well, throughout Wales, although sort of we tend to, the focus it often tends to be on North Wales. We need to remember that, of course, there were other castles built during that period, castles such as Chirk in mid Wales. But it was very much through the building of the line of castles across North Wales that Edward I stamped his authority and his control over the lands. And so Andy was going to sort of talk about that and illustrate that. I'm looking to my colleagues a bit to sort of join in, as I'm probably going to begin to flounder soon. But I mean, I suppose one aspect of that was the enormous cost of it. It was the sort of construction of all the castles was tremendous, wasn't it? John, thank you for joining us and
okay, and
coming to my aid. John is one of the most respected authorities on the castles of Wales, and co-editor with Diane Williams of the book on the impact of the Edwardian castles. Off the top of your head, how much did it cost to construct all those castles?
Oh God, you really got me there without scrambling down to my bookcase downstairs. But something on the top of my mind is that it cost more for Edward to man his armies in the two Welsh wars than it actually did to build the castles. But I may be wrong. Jeremy might be able to correct me on that. It's a great shame that Andy can't be with us, and maybe he can give a lecture to the society at another date. The final paragraph in your sort of summary of what his talk was going to be: can their design really be attributed to the genius of a single overarching mastermind? I know that's a topic that's been tossed to and fro by various people over the last few years, but that was my well, not one of the main reasons for wanting to hear Andy talk, but that was the key thing, to see what he had to say, whether he was coming down on the Arnold Taylor side or the Nicky Coldstream side, so that was my sort of main interest. I'm still firmly in the camp of Nicky Coldstream. I think that a case like I think Malcolm to some extent, Malcolm Hislop to some extent, and Taylor, pointing to the great Savoyard influence on the castles, of which there is in certain aspects. It's more like, thinking that the whole thing was Master James of St. George is rather like telling your grandmother to how to suck eggs, that the crown was perfectly able and had perfectly able staff to create these superb monuments without necessarily having influence from southeast France, Italy, the Savoy area. And when you look at sort of what Gilbert de Clare was doing in the first phase at Kathleen, very late 1260s, and what the Crown was doing in Ireland at Roscommon, where we have almost a sort of a match for Beaumaris to some extent. And that's well before Master James of St George arrived in the country. That also leads me to seeing, along with Nicky Coldstream, perhaps that James of St George, on the whole, was largely a sort of a superb administrator and coordinator for these rather than a designer. I don't know whether Jeremy or others disagree with me.
Okay, could I jump in? And this is with apologies that I didn't necessarily hear everything that John said, having had in this pandemic world of having to run to open the door to let the postman in. But anyway, that's another thing. I'm very much a believer that the Arnold Taylor view of all of this is springing fully formed from the mind of James of St George doesn't work for a number of reasons, and that actually looking at the context of castle building in the decades both before and after can be very illuminating. The idea that the castles of Edward I were architecturally innovative, I think, doesn't necessarily stand up, and I think much architectural writing about castles was based on an assumption that the Edward I castles were innovative, and as a consequence, a number of other relevant structures were misdated because it was felt that they had to be derivative to ride on the coattails of James of St George, whereas actually the evidence seems to be much stronger that they were already in existence and were available as exemplars for James and his organization to call on. So while this work, I think, is still ongoing, and I don't necessarily go all the way that some critics have done to suggest that James of St George had no creative impulse of his own, was purely a logistics specialist who knew how to get castles built but didn't really know what he was doing. I simply believe that is a mistake and is going too far in the other direction. I'm invigorated by the way that present day scholars such as Neal Ludlow are looking, I think, quite closely and with quite open mind about a wider range of structures, and I believe that whether it will form a new consensus is yet to see, but I think that some of that writing leads in some good directions.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Philip, speaking of costs, a quick scroll through some of my notes here says that De Ganwy cost £10,000 and Carnarvon something like £22,000. So there's quite a range depending on the size and scale and challenges of location and so forth in the cost there.
Paul, have you got your National Archives ready, Reckner, to hand to translate that into a modern amount?
You beat me to it. Give me a second. It'll be many thousands of horses. I should say, by the way, that there's currently there was a long-running, which I'm sure Jeremy and John will know. There was a long-running project in Wales led by Arnold Taylor and others, J. Beverley Smith, etc., to actually produce an edition of the surviving accounts for the medieval Welsh castles. That kind of didn't quite get to fruition because illness, death, etc. But Dr. Susan Davis at University of Aberystwyth is trying to resurrect that at the moment. So hopefully there may well be some movement in that front, but that remains to be seen. Bear with me while I get to this. Carry on talking.
Sorry, Alastair had his hand up first. Please have it.
Well done, Alastair.
There we are. Yeah, no, sorry, it wasn't actually me putting my hand up. I think I was just scratching my forehead. But no, it's a fascinating discussion. But well done for bringing me in there. Thank you. Beaumaris isn't completed, is it? Am I right in saying that it isn't completed? And I just think that sort of pins into. I mean, it's the sort of the great sort of symmetrical masterpiece that was actually unfinished, isn't it? But I just think that in terms of costs, isn't one of the reasons why it's not completed because there's a running out of money?
Yeah.
I mean, it is a practical element of lordship, isn't it? And actually of kingship, that you actually have to have the funds to plough into the building projects. And the other point that I would make about building of castles, particularly robust castles, the likes of Carnarvon. I mean, as I mentioned, the castle that's built in 1277 at Wilth as well is actually one of the smallest examples, which, as I said, sadly, foundations at the moment is all that's left. You have to go through really a rather sort of charming, but nonetheless it's a housing sort of estate that you have to walk through to get to the entrance of it. A lot of these places, especially those built of stone, it takes time, doesn't it? It takes time to build these things. And in a place like the March, where, as I said, try to sort of reiterate what everyone else has been saying for so long, a place where, a modus vivendi, a modus operandi is warfare or is violence, and it is an unsettled, even the best of times, you could say it was an unsettled region, I think. I don't think that's necessarily too controversial. The one thing that you don't have necessarily is the space and time to be able to build massive fortifications. And I think that's shown. I mean, Dr. John Kenyon mentioned Caerphilly. That's precisely what Llewellyn does with Caerphilly. He doesn't attack it once, he attacks it twice, he destroys it both times. There's an agreement that has to be made between him, Gilbert de Clay's castle, it eventually ends up being, and Llewellyn, that it's in royal hands, I think, for 12 months. I think that is that correct? And Gilbert ignores the king's proclamations that the castle shouldn't have anyone there, issues instructions for people to continue building work, and Llewellyn promptly then goes in and destroys it all again. I mean, theirs is a fractious relationship anyway, Gilbert the Red and Llewellyn. But anyway, no, I just thought it was Beaumaris, however, even if it is unfinished, I think it's beautiful. But that's as an aside.
Well, Beaumaris, if I may just jump in, I mean, Beaumaris is an interesting case in point because what's there was built within 2 building seasons. So it demonstrates that if you're Edward I and you put your full weight behind it, some staggering things can happen.
Absolutely.
And that's an amazing achievement. But exactly as you say, you've got to have the money, and you've got to have the money precisely at the moment when this is there. And of course, 1296, 1297, this is not an easy time if you're Edward I. As James of St. George and Walter of Winchester write, God forbid, if we have wars against France and Scotland, who knows what will happen? Well, they did. And what happened is the pace of work at Beaumaris fell off very, very fast and never really resumed. I mean, the discussion we were having at the very beginning about working out what the cost is, it's always worth bearing in mind that, I mean, Arnold Taylor could only ever work out what the total cost was. And an awful lot of this, there's a very long tail of the building project at Wales that goes on well into the mid 14th century at sites like Carnarvon. They just kept trying to pick it up and they never really succeeded. Beaumaris, I think, you can see from the building fabric that at some point, I couldn't really put a date to it, but I think it must be within the second quarter of the 14th century. They just thought enough was enough. We will start putting crenellations onto the towers that have never got their top story. And, but we shouldn't get over fussed about the fact that it was never that the architectural vision was never completed. It clearly worked. It remained a castle, and it was actually quite effective through the rest of the Middle Ages, and performed some role as a centre of government through into the 17th century. So, it didn't need all of the things that they initially conceived for it. It was big enough and effective enough, and may I say also sited in a very, very intelligent location, that it was able to perform what I can only infer is its purpose. And I must come back to this. This is something I'm thinking about quite a lot at the moment. How far one should or could go in unpicking one of the central assumptions in so much work on the Edwardian castles, that they were intended as centres of government for the new colonial structure of North Wales. I know it seems ridiculous to imagine that they weren't, but actually when you look at Conwy and Carnarvon, all the good stuff in government happens outside the castles, in complexes around the justices' lodging, in complexes around the town gates, in complexes around where the exchequer was, where clearly they had sort of setups there. So that's where government happened. Actually, Carnarvon Castle, we can't really find an awful lot going on there apart from imprisoning people. And I'm trying to work my way through some of this at the moment, that it seems to me rather interesting that actually Harlech, relatively small, for some reason was a centre of government. The Exchequer was based there. The Sheriff of Merioneth was based there. Court hearings did genuinely take place in a hall of pleas inside the castle in a way that Conwy and Carnarvon were not. And I don't know why, but I'm trying to get to grips with that at the moment. And I just throw that out there. I've probably said too much already.
No, that's great, Jeremy. Because in a sense, I suppose, you know, one thing that's going through my mind is that, you know, could you say that if part of the reason for building the castles was to stamp Edward's authority across North Wales, then almost by default, once built, they became redundant because the native threat had been sort of had come to an end, and although there were sort of some rebellions, none were actually of a scale that required that number of castles of that size and strength, and so almost in achieving their objective, they became redundant.
I think for me, and I really appreciate other people's opinions about this too, for me in the long term, that's true. In the short term, not so much. I find the way that the castles performed in the rebellion of Madoc ap Llywelyn in the 1290s, and a very telling moment. And I get the feeling that there was a quite significant course correction in a number of aspects of government and in the way the castles were built and the way they were operated at that moment. But the ones that were there had proved their worth. By the way, is it not interesting to anyone else that Anglesey had become an English shire and had become a shire under the Statute of Rhuddlan, and yet didn't get a castle until Madoc Llewellyn's rebellion demonstrated that it was necessary? And I do wonder whether Edward I was ever going to get round to it, or whether, you know, some people have suggested that he was going to refortify the motte at Abercleniog or something of that kind. I just don't know. But it's, again, that's another thing that makes me wonder about how central they were to the English government, that for 10 years we didn't have one on Anglesey, which is strategically and economically and culturally very, very important. So who knows?
I can make a comment to Jeremy mentioning about sort of centre of power, centre of government at not necessarily castle centred at Conwy and Carnarvon, but there's a good evidence for it from the documents at Harlech. But at least at Carnarvon and Conwy, of course, you've got the town and the associated buildings below the castle there. While at Harlech, you really haven't got much other than the castle. So the best place to have a sheriff based and courts held, etc., would be within the confines at Harlech Castle. While in Conwy and Carnarvon, you know, there's plenty of scope elsewhere other than the castle itself. Anyway, just a thought.
Okay. So, Paul, what has the National Archives Ready Reckoner told us?
Right. Okay. So, bearing in mind all of the caveats that you need to bear in mind, in 2017, Kathleen's £22,000 would have been the equivalent of 16.18 million in currency money. However, in 1290, that would have bought you 26,000 horses, basically 50,000 cows, just under 100,000 stones of wool, 85,000 quarters of wheat, and this is probably the interesting figure, 2.2 million days of work from skilled tradesmen. So, I mean, you can see how Edward I is doing it. If 2.2 million days of workmen is what effectively he's putting into one castle, that's going to be, you know, logistically one of the best ways, one of the best reasons why he's able to do it. There's manpower.
I mean, so looking at John and Jeremy, do the records give us any indication of where he got the materials from? Because for such a large-scale building program, was he able to source the material, stone and wood, locally, or was it being quarried and brought in from England?
A bit of both. And yeah, I mean, Arnold Taylor's work is all about the construction program, and this is one of those topics that he was fascinated by. And those who've got their history of the King's works to hand may remember that he had great fun in putting together a map with all sorts of big arrows all over it of where the stuff and where the people came from, which Cadw have kindly reproduced in glorious colour in all of the pictures. It's a bit of everything. Some of it was resources that was to hand. You know, clearly they don't want to move stone or timber further than they have to, and the timber resource I think is very interesting. There's quite a lot of local forestry that clearly must have been, one hesitates to say must have been decimated, but actually, very, very heavy exploitation of that. A lot of the stone for the castles is relatively local, and the stuff that is quarried out of the ditches in order to prepare the ground, one assumes that quite a lot of that goes up. But there is other material that's brought in from elsewhere. New red sandstones from Cheshire are quite easy to spot within the building fabric, and likewise the personnel comes from all over. But I think there is, that there are a lot that are coming from the north of England, and a lot that are coming from the northwest of England. And lest we forget, going with the walled towns are, going with the castles are the walled towns, and we know for a number of them where the settlers for them come from. And while some of them, Conwy, they come from all over. For Beaumaris and Criccieth, for example, they come very much from the Welsh Marches and from the northwest of England. So clearly there are sort of, concerted efforts in certain parts of the country to drum up resources and people for the North Wales Castles project.
Does anyone have an answer for Jensen's question in the chat about Chirk?
Yes, I was just going to come to that. Thank you, Kathleen. Jensen Jones has asked, why is it that Chirk Castle is very much intact compared with other castles? Has it had some rebuilding? Now, just to sort of remind people of the context of that, Chirk was the lordship that was granted to a younger son of the Roger Mortimer, who was active in this time, the Roger Mortimer that Alastair spoke about, and who died in 1282. And he himself was rewarded with new Marcher lordships. The lordship of Chirk was granted to his younger son, another Roger, who became known as Roger Mortimer of Chirk. And as I indicated at the start of this discussion, one of the other notable castles that was built in this period. And I think, I'm not sure, again, looking to Jeremy possibly as John has disappeared, again, it is assumed that, well, it's known that, again, that Edward I took a personal interest in the building of Chirk, and there is some evidence of of his involvement and in the design. So Chirk is very much a castle of this period. But yes, it's an interesting question, why it has remained intact. Clearly, yes, it has had extensive further building. It's one of the fascinating things about Chirk Castle, and this is in part the answer, is that it has remained in occupation from when it was first built by Roger Mortimer at the end of the 13th century through till today. And so in some senses, the question actually is, rather than why it's intact, is why has it remained in use and remained lived in as a family home? Because that explains why it is intact. because it remained in use and has remained the family home from late 13th century to now. And if you're familiar with Chirk, one of the fascinating aspects about it is how over the centuries since the 1290s, the different owners have extended and added on to it. And so you can see the influences across each century as new buildings were added on, or new buildings were converted or refurbished into the current style. And so there are styles of building and usage of rooms across all the centuries. So that's why it's intact, because it remained in use. And so, as I said, I think the interesting question is why Chirk remained a castle in use and in occupation, whereas other castles fell out of use and became derelict and abandoned. So do you have any thoughts on that, Jeremy?
Well, I think, you know, what you've said sort of duplicates the little that I know about Chirk and goes well beyond it. So I don't really want to say too much about that, although I am quite interested in why this particular baronial castle survived while others such as Denbigh or Hope or others, you know, completely, you know, didn't. My good friend John Goodall once said that if you're a baron, even a quite rich baron, each castle that you own is represents a larger proportion of your estate and your, you know, your baronial dignity than if you're the King of England and you've got 120 properties spread across the country, including in some parts that you're probably not ever going to go to or go to that often. You know, the requirements of managing the Crown estate is huge and terrible, and you can understand why certain properties just got away from them, and the North Wales castles definitely fit within that category. They were physically suffering by 1320, they were physically in a terrible state by 1343, and all attempts to keep them going clearly were, at their very best, were keeping pace, but otherwise were falling behind. And you can sort of understand why, particularly with the coup de grace of the English Civil War, probably with some relief, the authorities said, okay, we're just not going to bother with this nonsense anymore. Let us have a proper shire hall standing next to the castle. Let us have a proper jailhouse in the town. Let us devolve what functions of government we can to somewhere else and just let this go. I think that seems to be what's going on. Chirk, exactly as you say, it remains not just in occupation, but in quite grand occupation, which I suppose is why it doesn't often get spoken of in the same breath as some of the other castles of the Edwardian project, simply because archaeologists, architectural historians are a bit sniffy about it because it keeps getting updated in a way that some of the others don't. So that your medieval purist can have more fun with Conway or Harlech than perhaps they can with the more frilly Georgian bits of Chirk.
I mean, in very simplistic terms, generally castles fell out of use because, yes, just from there was a limit to how comfortable you could make them, and you know, as over time their defensive, both sort of effectiveness as a form of defence lessened, then there was no need for a castle. Alastair, were you going to say something?
I was fascinated earlier, if I could just ask Jeremy yet another question. Sorry about all these questions. But what you were saying earlier about, I'm just thinking of walled towns, or what was said earlier, walled towns being attached to castles, and those castles that have walled towns out with them, potentially not being the centres of administration because there's the places in those towns which are defensible by the very nature of the fact that they are walled. Whether or not that might have something to do with what you were saying about certain castles surviving and thriving and others not so much, at least at certain periods. I mean, and also location. You know, Chirk is over towards the non-existent church, well, I should say non-existent border between England and Wales, more towards Offa's Dyke, isn't it? It's not sort of right smack bang in the middle of, I suppose, in one way, of Wales, as say somewhere like Builth is. Although actually, well, you could argue either way there, couldn't you? But anyway, I suppose my question is, what's the impact of these wall towns? Because I know that the wall town at Ayton, it doesn't so much as spell curtains for the castle there, but it doesn't help necessarily. So you've got this odd kind of paradox where the more you plough into defensive sites out with the castles, you've got to maintain the castle as well itself. You're bringing in trade and money and commerce, but it's then up to you as the Lord to ensure that some of that goes towards maintaining the castle. And if you don't bother to do that and you want to use it for other things, it goes back to your point about cash flow and having the money ready to hand, doesn't it? Long-winded question.
Yeah, no, but it's a fascinating topic, and I think this is one where actually a new generation rethinking some of these questions will identify complexities that haven't been picked up in the record so far. Because I mean, what you're saying is undeniably true, that because the towns such as Carnarvon and Conway were well developed, they had a complete circuit of defences. The burgage plots, at least in some period, were used up. There were buildings there, and clearly from the very beginning they imagined certain spaces within those towns where there would be other governmental buildings that were constructed and were used throughout the Middle Ages. Harlech and Beaumaris, we will never know whether that was the intention, but they just didn't follow through with it for a number of reasons. I mean, Harlech clearly never takes off as a borough. It's in a difficult, mountainous location. So physically, to create something there of the scale of Aberystwyth or the scale of Conwy would be extraordinarily challenging. And as far as we know, they never even started building a wall around the outside. So I can sort of get the point. Beaumaris is a bit more interesting. Beaumaris is, of course, commercially probably the most effective of all of them because of its location, because of the very generous monopolies of trade that Edward of Carnarvon, as Prince of Wales in the 1300s, first gave, that I think are endorsed by all subsequent people. Basically, that any ship nearing the court of Anglesey must call in at Beaumaris and display its goods for trade and nowhere else. That serve them very nicely, thank you very much. And I can well imagine that if they'd actually got on with building the wall the way around, that they might well have ended up building a shire hall and building an exchequer over one of the town gates and all those other sort of kind of things. But for some reason, I don't know, it was never high enough on the list of priorities, and they never really got on with it. So there is I'm sure there's a relationship somewhere, but quite what comes first, I don't know. And I don't, at the moment I can't quite make my mind up about how important this is, whether it significantly devalues Carnarvon or Conwy Castle, that other interesting stuff was going on elsewhere. But I would quite like to know what on a typical day was going on at Carnarvon Castle, because it's a jolly big thing. They clearly don't abandon it as a folly. They keep coming back and adding new things to it, and they keep trying to finish it. And it's only, I think, after the Black Death, really, that they kind of think, oh, to hell with it, and just make do with what they have. So I don't know, did they ever really imagine that, the absent king of England would return in non-desperate circumstances and would want somewhere grand and palatial to fly his banner and show himself in state? Of course, what they finally got was the desperate Richard II in the fag end of his kingship, moving from one of these sites to another and thinking none of them have got any furniture in it. As John Creton says, I can hardly speak of the king's wretchedness. And thereafter, never again. But yeah.
Can I just make comments? So apologies for disappearing. My computer decided to crash and I just managed to log in. I just wanted to ask really more for a point of information from Paul. He mentioned the work of Susan Davis, and Susan was on council at the National Museum of Wales when I was still employed there, and mentioned the business of developing what Beverly Smith and Arnold Taylor had been working on, which I think was not just more details of the cost of building, but also the actual military campaigns themselves. I just wonder whether Paul knows how far Susan has got in sort of working on that side of things. It's been a good few years before I've actually sort of been able to speak to Susan.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, she's not been able to get any funding for like her project. But she sent me. I actually got an email this morning from her to tell her that pleasing news. She'd basically finalised all of the transcriptions that she'd been working on, got them to a point, as in that she'd been collating from all of the other members of the project team over the years. And so I think she's now got to a point where that's almost in a publishable state. There's indexing work to complete. There's a variety of references to check, I think, but I think she needs a bit of financial assistance to get it over the line.
Do you know what year she was covering? I can't remember. Don't worry. But
yeah, I do. She did some, but unfortunately, it's on my work laptop, not my home laptop.
Yeah, that's okay.
But I think it is. I think it's the full 1270s.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, Jeremy.
Well, I would just like to make some observations about the accounts, and I've trod some of the same path that many others have done, and come to a conclusion that doesn't get stated that often, which is that the accounts in some instances don't do what people expect them to do. Right. A transcription of the accounts will be wonderful for economic history. There's no doubt about that. It will not enable you to reconstruct the castles in any way. They are very, very light on detail. It will not enable you to say anything much about what either they were intended for or what people did with them. But it will answer questions about how much was spent, where the materials came from, where the people will come from. And that is, is beyond rubies. So it's absolutely wonderful. My own sort of experience about this was the revelation to me, and I know Arnold Taylor did some of this as well, was to start looking more at the accounts of the Chamberlains of North Wales and the accounts of the bailiffs in the SC6 series starting in 1170 and the SC6 series starting in 1216. They are wonderful because they do describe all through our period the operation of these things. And I wish I could find the time and the headspace to produce a transcript of those, because they basically write a book about how you create a colonial structure from scratch, and how it evolves in unexpected ways very quickly and over a prolonged period of time thereafter. I think it's a truly fascinating story, and I've never seen it described anywhere except in E.A. Lewis's book about the boroughs of Snowdonia, published in 1912, which hardly any castle specialists have ever looked at because it hasn't got castles in the title. But it's one of the most informative books about castles I have ever read, because it's going over much of this territory.
Thank you. Kirsten, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Have any questions come through to you?
Yes, there are a few. Just to pick up on the Chirk Castle question, Kate Whittles has said, owning coal mines and ironworks during the Industrial Revolution gave them the money to renovate it. So they had a sort of second wind, so to speak. And then I have a question from Rebecca Williams. It has been suggested that Edward I's wife, Eleanor, had input into the design of Carnarvon Castle, the Eagle Castle with 3 turrets that was of Castilian design. Is there much evidence of this in other castles of Edward I?
Jeremy?
A little, and this is Rachel Swallow's thesis, and anyone who has got access to Archaeologia Cambrensis should read it, because it's long and complicated. And I pass over the question of whether I accept in detail all the points that she makes. So to answer the question, yes, Eleanor's influence can only be inferred, but it can be inferred at other places, and Leeds Castle in Kent is another quite interesting one, which was of her estate rather than Edward I's estate. And while the castle itself has been massively mucked about in subsequent periods. So trying to identify what it looked like in the 13th century is no easy task. There are a number of accounts that help work this out, and clearly some concept of a castle as a rural residence for pleasure rather than for government or for military defense is definitely there, and it was on her watch that it took that form. So I think it's a legitimate line of inquiry, certainly.
I have a question from Sarah. So were the castles then just the king's statement of wealth and power rather than being intended to be government buildings?
John?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Were the castles just the king's statement of wealth and power rather than being used as government buildings?
I don't think there's necessarily a statement of wealth, because one knew about the kings of England and their wealth and resources anyway, even if it did rely on a certain amount of bankers' loans to finance his castles and his armies. I mean, there's certainly, all those castles are certainly making a statement, as do many of, whether it's a Caerphilly or a Pembroke or whatever, Wigmore or Ludlow, they're all making a statement at certain times in their original construction and later development. But I don't think, certainly Edward didn't need to display his wealth through his castles. It was certainly his power.
And then
Kirsten, can I just interrupt you for a second, please? Because I'm aware that we can carry on in a minute, but I'm aware that some people are sort of starting to leave us, and also aware that Kathleen needs to leave us, because conscious that it's now probably getting quite late in the night for Kathleen. So as I said, we happy for the discussion to carry on. But I think we do need to thank all the speakers, but need to thank Kathleen, have the opportunity to thank Kathleen for her wonderful talk, and allow Kathleen to get to bed. And I see, Kathleen, that one of your students is now sucking up to you.
Yes. That's all right.
That's my job.
I don't know if you noticed, I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name. There's another of your students in the audience, Kathleen.
Oh.
But
Yes.
Can I just say, Philip, I'm going to have to leave now to go a short break,
Okay.
because I got another webinar or talk from Richard III Society at 2. So
of course.
Thanks to you, and hopefully Andy, we'll catch up with Andy at another time.
Yeah. Well, before you do leave us, John, I want to just give huge thanks to yourself and to Jeremy for coming to my rescue. The fact that we're now 10 minutes beyond the sort of formal end time, I think is just an indication of the sort of knowledge and expertise that you've brought to this discussion, that with no notice at all, you've leapt into the breach. Particularly Jeremy, when you were just sort of logging on at 12 o'clock expecting to listen to a talk, and you have very kindly now joined in and shared your knowledge with us, and John also. So huge thanks for coming to my rescue.
Well, not at all. And as anyone who knows John and me will know, this is a conversation that we're having all the time by email anyway. It's nice to do it face to face, and
right,
indeed.
There, but it's this is no hardship. I don't think I can speak for both of us. It's
yeah.
And if you're happy to stay on for a few more minutes, Jeremy, you might notice what my Zoom background picture is.
Yes, Wigmore. Oops. Yes, sorry about that. But we can talk further on. But perhaps not today.
Okay, not today. That's fine.
Bye, Philip.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks, John. Bye, John.
Thank you, Philip, for having me, and thank you, everyone.
Bye, Kathleen. Enjoy the rest of the
Thank you. And I I just want to express my thanks to Alastair too, because I'm sure I'll be thinking about his paper for a long time. And it really gave me actually quite a new, a deeper insight into the way that the Marcher presence in Parliament might be shaping all of this. So thank you so much. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you, Kathleen. And yes, the weather is improving now. So people might be able to get outside this afternoon. But yes, and so yes, whilst we're just doing the official things, yes.
Can I say, I mean, I could stay for about another 10 minutes. Family life requires, and by the way, apologies that I couldn't join earlier. My webinar came earlier than this rather than the other. So, yeah.
Right, one with young archaeologists?
That's the one about Clifford's Tower in York from the same period. So all good stuff.
So I'll just add thanks to Alastair for, yes, some very interesting insights into Lord Edward as a Marcher Lord. So Kirsten, you said there were a couple more questions?
Earlier from Val, which said, did they have a template for building a castle with perhaps an architect who supervised the actual building?
It's a good question, and quite how to interpret template I'm not sure about, but they get going so quickly for some of them that one has to imagine that something existed on paper before they got round to it. I think that the process of inventing the designs is one of the more mysterious elements of all of this, and there have been debates about it, about whether James of St. George is the driving creative force behind it, and questions have been raised, about that. Certainly much of the supervision of the building on a day-to-day basis was done by other people. Whether we would call them architects in the modern parlance is a moot point. The equation between modern architect and medieval master mason is a notoriously difficult one, and the master masons are the people whose names by and large we know. So I think the suggestion must have been, yes, there were some drawings in circulation from very early in the process, if not before the process. I simply think that Beaumaris Castle has the feel for me of something that had been kicking around for a while, and they were just waiting for the opportunity and the resources to do it, because it's the kind of castle where if you've got a flat site, you could build it anywhere. Some of the others very clearly respond to the detailed topography of the locations in which they're constructed. So, but there may be adaptation of something earlier. So Conwy Castle, if anyone knows it, for example, is perfectly regular, except for the fact that one element of it suddenly goes banana shaped because it bows out across the rock. Is it possible that what existed on paper was something that was a straightforward rectangle that they just bent around a bit when they decided that that was going to be the kind of location that it would need to go, and worked out the scale afterwards? I suppose the final point that's making is that when you look at the fabric of the castles, even such good castles in detail, and the book that Malcolm Heslop has recently published about James of St. George is particularly good on this, you can see all sorts of tweaks during the construction process, where clearly there were certain things they hadn't worked out in detail, and that they realized they'd made mistakes when they went. So the internal plan of Conwy Castle actually shows some moments where there are cross walls that actually cut across where window and arrow loop embrasures had been built in the outer wall. They clearly got the external envelope, the defensive external envelope, built first, and then fitted the internal structures into it afterwards. And it sort of fit, but in a few details it didn't. And you can see them making that up as they go. So clearly, if there were templates in existence before they got going, they had to be adapted in an ongoing dialogue between the design and the site, and between the different specialists involved in the process.
Thank you. I was just, as an ex-designer, this idea of having plans on paper, I would have thought that model making was probably more likely, that you would present to the king, look, this is kind of what I'm going to build for you. And as you say, it would all sort of have to adapt as you went along and you realise you had a rock face in the way and all that sort of thing. So, is there any evidence of model making?
Malcolm Heslop has looked at this. There's an article, I think it's in the British Archaeological Association from about 3 or 4 years ago, where the first documentary evidence that he could find of, I can't even now remember what the word is, but he suggested that actually it was a physical three-dimensional model rather than a drawing of a plan or a plat that was there. I think from our period, I absolutely take that it would be a sensible way to go forward, but I'm not sure that we have any evidence that suggests that such a thing existed.
Okay, thank you.
And Stella, have you got your hand up again?
Yeah, yes, I have. Somebody like me who has very little knowledge of this subject, but is finding it equally fascinating to all the other things that we ever talk about. I'm just thinking that in my dim and distant past, I read that Worcestershire, for instance, has so few stone castles either still in existence or known about, even less than a handful. Because there were so many wooden castles, certainly in the post-Norman period. And I'm just wondering whether there's very much knowledge amongst us about the development of wooden castles prior to stone castles, whether they were used as experiments to see whether, certainly in a military campaign, it was feasible to use these things for any significant reason, and whether there's much knowledge of where apparent wooden castles might have existed, and whether this is of any significance whatsoever to our subject matter of today.
Yeah, Alastair?
Just to jump ahead of you, sorry, Jeremy, if I could. 2 articles I found really useful, which are available online. In fact, I think if you Google them, they might come up as one of the first 5 hits, PDF-wise, on the subject of timber-framed castles. C.J. Spurgeon's article on Wilth Castle, which was really, really useful for me, which is actually, I think, in Bricenniog from 1978 to 79. And also DJ Cathcart King did a very good article, actually. It's 1961. It's an older article, but it's no less fantastic for the detail that he provides, that is provided, in there. And we've mentioned Rachel Swallow already, and the archaeological evidence is obviously going to be very, very important. I just wanted to also, just a little point, don't know about to Kirsten's question about models. That's fascinating. Don't we know that in certain circles they're making toys? I mean, Edward II, doesn't he? He has a toy castle. We don't know whether Edward I does, but we know Edward II definitely did. Now, we don't know, I don't know whether that's reflective of a wider trend or whether it's something specific to royal children. Perhaps Jeremy could say something on that. I wouldn't have a clue.
No, I can't, and I've never chased that up. It's one of Arnold Taylor's footnotes in History of the King's Works, and I've always had in mind to look that one up, because I do remember in my slightly embarrassing past life, when I worked for Historical Palaces at the Tower of London, I was best friends with the costumed interpreters, and at Christmas we always used to do exciting Edward I things. And I remember on one occasion we planned one where James of St George was going to come to see Edward I at the Tower, bringing a plan of the castle, and Edward was going to go, no, you build it like this or whatever. I can't remember. I don't think we got as far as making a model, but that sounds like a great idea. It's really good. But yeah, Edward II was given a toy castle and toy knights. I think this much is clear. I ought to look this one up because it would be great. And of course, it's it sort of fits in nicely with taking us forward to the 19th century, that Prince Albert, had the toy fort built in the grounds of Osborne, so that so that his children were going to learn to be generals, and he got the generals from the army to come over and sort of instruct them about artillery and other things with using the toy fort. So who knows? And it never really goes away. It'd be fantastic. For timber castles, I mean, one other reading that's worth looking at, which saves me from having to answer the question in detail because I don't know, is Bob Hyam produced the book called Timber Castles, one of the theses of which is we have all got so hung up on the stone castles because they survive and we can talk about them, that we forget that timber castles continued to be built and continued to evolve right through the Middle Ages. And, you know, and they don't seem to have been considered as necessarily inferior to the stone ones. Unfortunately, the evidence that they leave archaeologically is by its nature so ephemeral that the conclusions that you can draw from them are quite limited, but it's certainly worth looking at. Whether that equates with a causal relationship or why you don't get so many in Worcestershire, I don't know, but it's worth bearing in mind. Why does Worcestershire have so few when Shropshire, just up the road, has some of the greatest number in Britain? Hard to know.
Yes. This is Stella again here. When I originally read about the Worcestershire castles, I think it was that it was just on the way to somewhere else, sort of thing. And so apparently there are the fewest number of stone castles in all the English counties. So it's something that I would like to look up and develop knowledge of. But it sounds to me as though we have to look at this fantastic subject from a very holistic point of view. You know, the variability of all these things is just so huge. Virtually everything in human existence impinges on it, doesn't it? The economics, the circumstances, the terrain, everything. And so, well, it's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your perseverance, Stella, on staying on the phone for over 3 hours now. It can't be easy.
It's been worth it, very much so.
It can't be easy just listening on the phone. I'm very conscious, Jeremy, that you have actually given us slightly more than the 10 minutes we agreed a short while ago. So I really do think we need to let Jeremy go. And yes, thanks. And I think, you know, I think the other tribute is how many people, you may have seen the comments that have come through on the chat, how many people have enjoyed the last hour, but also how many people stayed with us certainly until 12:45. Then, although it wasn't the talk that had been publicised, nearly all the audience did stay with us. So I'll let you go now, Jeremy, and thanks very much for stepping into the breach.